Today we are talking about what has to be the single biggest source of financial frustration for, well, almost everyone right now. You see these headlines that should feel good.
Right.
You hear economists and central banks sort of declaring victory, saying things like inflation is coming down.
The worst is behind us.
Exactly. And yet, when you check your bank balance or you walk through the supermarket, that so-called victory, it just feels hollow.
It really does. Your paycheck still feels like it's just instantly consumed by the basics, rent, fuel, food. You feel, I think, profoundly poorer than you did maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah, and that disconnect is the real mystery we're diving into. If inflation is officially falling, why do you still feel like you're losing this financial race?
So today we're going to give you three core interconnected reasons that really explain this feeling. We'll break down the complex stuff into something real, the difference between the price level and inflation speed.
What actually happened to our paychecks?
And crucially, why the official inflation number almost certainly underestimates your personal experience.
Plus, we'll look at the massive global consequence of all this. I mean, this isn't just a personal annoyance. The cost of living crisis is now classified as a major global risk that's pulling focus away from other huge threats, like climate change. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Let's start with, I think, the most common misconception, which is just a basic misunderstanding of what the word inflation even means. Most people hear, inflation is falling, and they think, great, prices are finally falling.
And that's totally understandable, but, economically speaking, it's completely wrong. Inflation is purely the speed at which prices are going up.
It's the rate of change.
Exactly. The price itself, that's the level. That's the height of the mountain we're all standing on now.
This is where that elevator analogy is so perfect for getting your head around it.
Yeah.
So imagine you're in an elevator going up, say, a 50-story building.
Okay.
In 2021, the elevator was just rising at a normal, steady pace.
And then came 2022, the central banks, well, they kind of lost control for a bit, and that elevator just sped up dramatically.
Whoosh.
That was your high inflation year. We're talking globally, around 8 to 9%, sometimes even higher.
But now, the central banks have basically achieved their goal. They've put the brakes on.
A process called disinflation.
Right. So the elevator has slowed way down. Maybe it's only rising at, 3 to 5% now, depending on where you are?
But the crucial point, and this is everything, is that the elevator is still rising.
It's just slower.
It has simply slowed its rate of ascent. It has not suddenly dropped back down to the ground floor.
It did not go back down, no.
Precisely. That huge accumulated price jump from the peak inflation years, especially 2022, is now permanently embedded in the economy.
It's baked in.
It's baked in. Lower inflation just means prices are rising more slowly. It doesn't mean they've reversed. If milk cost $3 in 2021 and it jumped to $3.30 in 2022 and now it's $3.40, even if inflation drops to zero, the milk is still $3.40.
And that new price level is what dictates your daily spending. That's the first big reason you feel poorer. Okay, that makes perfect sense. We have this permanently higher cost baseline that we're all dealing with. So let's shift from the cost of goods to the other side of the equation.
Our ability to pay for them.
Our paychecks. This brings us to the idea of real wages.
Yeah, and this is the second reason for that constant strain. We have to separate two ideas. There's your nominal wage. That's just the number on your payslip.
Number on the paper.
And then there's your real wage, which is what that money can actually buy you, your purchasing power. And what happened between, say, 2021 and 2023 created a very deep hole for a lot of people.
The sources are really clear on this. Inflation just went crazy and wages did not keep up.
They lagged, and they lagged significantly. The OECD, they tracked this across 22 of their major member countries.
Okay.
And they found a really substantial decline in real household income. I mean, between late 2021 and late 2022, inflation outpaced the growth in nominal income by, on average, 2 full percentage points.
So in real terms, what I could buy with my paycheck was actively shrinking. I was getting poorer.
You were getting poorer year over year. Now we're starting to see signs of recovery.
Right.
Wages are finally starting to grow a bit faster than the current inflation rate, maybe in the euro area or in Brazil. So that sounds like we should be feeling richer now, right?
It sounds good, yeah. But there's a catch.
There's a huge catch. And this is the essential psychological part that explains that feeling. While your nominal wage might be rising faster than today's 3 or 4% inflation, that growth often hasn't been nearly enough to recover the massive cumulative loss of purchasing power you suffered during those 2 peak inflation years.
Oh, I'm not just looking at this year's positive growth. Subconsciously, I'm adding up the total loss from the last 3 years.
Yeah.
I'm just playing catch up.
You are absolutely playing catch up. That cumulative deficit is still there. I mean, look at the data on hardship. In the UK, for example, for low-income families, hardship measures showed basically no improvement over 2 years, all the way up to May 2025. So even with some positive annual growth now, models are suggesting that real disposable incomes could fall further, maybe by almost £700 over the next few years. That just shows the setback hasn't been fixed.
You feel like you're running just to stay in the same place.
And often you're actually still falling behind compared to where you were before all this started.
That brings us to the third reason, which I think really gets to why the number you see on the news just doesn't match what's happening in your wallet. Why is the official inflation rate almost always lower than your personal inflation rate?
This is such a crucial point. The official numbers like the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, or the HICP in Europe,
Right.
they're based on an average household spending basket. Some people call this the plutocratic approach.
That's a heavy word. Why plutocratic?
Well, because the index is weighted based on total spending. So if high-income households spend, say, 20 times more on luxury travel than low-income households, that travel gets a much bigger weight in the overall average.
Even if only a tiny percentage of people are actually buying it.
Exactly. The average basket just reflects where all the money is going in total.
But, I mean, none of us is an average household. So if I spend way more of my income on rent and food than on, say, electronics, my specific spending pattern
What some call the democratic approach.
is completely different.
Precisely. And that causes this huge dispersion in what inflation actually feels like. The data shows that households headed by older people, and critically, those with lower incomes, consistently experience a higher effective inflation rate than that national average you see on TV.
Can you give us some concrete examples of what's driving that gap?
It really just comes down to basic needs and fixed costs. Low-income households spend a much, much bigger share of their total budget on the very things that saw the biggest price spikes.
Like energy and food.
Exactly. I mean, in several Central and Eastern European countries, households are spending over 10% of their entire budget just on energy for their homes. And food is staggering. In Romania, it's 51% of the budget for low-income groups. It's 42% in Bulgaria.
So when something happens geopolitically and energy and food prices shoot up, those households get hit disproportionately hard compared to the official average.
That is the core finding. It's illustrated so starkly by the research. A UK study showed that in the year to early 2023, the inflation rate faced by the lowest income tenth of the population was a staggering 14%.
14.
14, compared to only 9% for the highest income tenth,
That's a 5-point gap.
a 5 percentage point gap. And it was mostly driven by energy price rises. That was about 3/4 of the gap, followed very closely by food prices.
That's just incredible. So if you're spending 60% of your money on rent, energy, and food, the things that have gone up the most, then an official 4 or 5% inflation number just feels wrong.
It feels like a lie, because your personal effective inflation rate is probably much, much higher.
And that totally explains the emotional disconnect.
Yeah, you're right to question the official number because it wasn't really designed to measure your experience. And statistical offices and central banks, they know this. That's why we're starting to see things like personal inflation calculators pop up online in Europe and the UK.
Okay, but if we know that the CPI doesn't accurately reflect what's happening to the lowest earners, why do central banks everywhere still rely on that one single number?
That's a great question, and the answer really comes down to complexity and consistency. For monetary policy to work for a central bank to decide on interest rates, they need one consistent, predictable benchmark for the whole economy.
So using a bunch of different numbers would just be chaos.
It would make national policy decisions incredibly complex, highly political, and maybe inconsistent. So the single measure, as flawed as it is for any one person, remains the standard for measuring overall price stability.
This hardship isn't just an abstract number, though. It's a real crisis that's now being recognized as a major global risk.
Absolutely. The World Economic Forum and other major bodies have classified the cost of living crisis as a massive short-term danger. The human toll is just undeniable.
What do the sources say about how severe it is on the ground?
Well, looking at the UK, for instance, huge numbers of low-income households, we're talking about 60% of that group, or 7.1 million families, were reportedly going without essentials in the 6 months leading up to May 2025.
That level of scarcity is just alarming in a developed country. What kind of essentials are we talking about?
The absolute basics. 5.3 million low-income families were cutting back on or just skipping meals. 4.1 million reported going hungry in a single month.
Wow.
And what's really worrisome is that these hunger levels have been pretty much consistent since late 2022. So even as the top-line economic forecasts improved, the lived reality for millions hadn't.
And things like food bank use are still going up.
Sadly, yes. It continues its upward trend, rising significantly among low-income families over the last few years.
And this squeeze isn't just hitting people at home. It's affecting global business, international stability.
It really is. The strain is widespread. High living costs, made worse by inflation and volatile currencies, are forcing even people you'd think are well off, like international assignees, people working abroad, to cut back on spending.
Some are struggling with basics.
Some are actually struggling to meet basic living needs in their new assignments, according to the data.
And if we zoom out to the wider global picture, this domestic stress is fueling instability, especially in developing nations.
That's the critical link. This crisis, amplified by things like war-related food supply disruptions, has fueled a growing global debt crisis. The UN identified 54 developing countries that are facing severe debt issues right now.
And that kind of financial instability, it threatens everything.
It threatens democratic progress, long-term stability in huge parts of the world. The problem in your wallet quickly becomes a global security risk.
So, given this massive crisis, what did governments do? How did they try to cushion the blow? Initially, we saw a lot of really broad, untargeted measures.
Yeah, things like subsidies and price caps on energy were very common.
They seemed like a quick fix.
They're politically easy, they feel immediate, but economically, they're incredibly messy. They're very costly to national budgets, and they can be regressive.
Meaning they actually help wealthier people more.
Sometimes, yes. They benefit people who consume more energy, which is often wealthier households, just as much as or more than low-income families. And crucially, they remove the incentive to save energy, which directly fights against climate goals.
So if those broad subsidies aren't the answer, what was the expert consensus?
The experts largely agreed that temporary targeted income support is a much better way to go.
So getting money directly to the people who need it most?
Exactly. It limits the burden on the budget, and it preserves those crucial price signals that encourage people to save energy.
And the sources show that even the people who were supposed to be helped by the untargeted approach sometimes lost out.
It created real friction. The research showed that these flat-rate, one-off cost of living payments often just didn't do enough for those who needed it most. For example, almost half of all families with multiple kids on benefits would have been better off if the government had just increased their normal benefits to keep pace with inflation in real time.
Instead of these crude, one-size-fits-all payments.
Exactly. It just shows how hard it is to design good policy under extreme pressure.
So now that inflation is finally easing, what is the IMF saying is the next big step for governments? Because the immediate fire is cooling, but the foundation still feels pretty shaky.
They're calling it the policy triple pivot. First, central banks are pivoting to a more neutral stance. Second, governments need to pivot their spending to rebuild the financial buffers they used up during the crisis.
And the third pivot.
That's the hardest one, structural reform. The IMF is saying that much more needs to be done to lift productivity and improve growth prospects. But those deep reforms, things like fixing housing shortages or making labor markets more flexible, they always face huge social resistance.
And this is where it all connects back to the beginning, to the idea of global risk. The immediate crisis is just sucking all the air out of the room.
Completely. The intense focus on solving the immediate cost of living crisis is diverting both money and political attention away from those critical long-term structural risks.
So we're seeing less investment in things like climate change.
Less investment, less policy bandwidth for climate mitigation, for biodiversity loss, for long-term investment in people. The intense focus on the next 2 years is, unfortunately, weakening our ability to deal with the next 10.
This has been a really illuminating deep dive. Let's just quickly summarize those 3 essential answers to our big question. Why do you still feel poor, even if inflation is falling?
First, because that accumulated price level from the last few years is permanent. The elevator's still high up, even if it's moving slower now.
Second.
Second, because the accumulated loss of real income from that period when your wages lagged inflation, it often hasn't been fully recovered. You're still running a deficit, just playing catch up.
And third, and maybe most importantly, Because your personal inflation experience, driven by things like energy, rent, and food, is very often significantly higher than that average official number you see on the news.
And if we tie this to the final global picture, the recovery is proving to be really uneven. Growth in places like Europe is lagging way behind North America and major Asian economies, and a country's ability to emerge from this really depends on tackling those deep, politically difficult structural issues.
So we'll leave you with this provocative thought to consider. Think about the policy trade-offs your government is making right now. In the very necessary effort to stabilize your immediate cost of living, are they inadvertently weakening the long-term economic foundation? By diverting resources and focus away from the critical structural reforms needed to boost productivity and address massive decade-long threats like climate change. Understanding that trade-off, that tension between now and later, is key to understanding the next decade of our political and financial stability.